Chapter 46 is about animal reproduction. We're going to be looking at both asexual and sexual reproduction. They both occur in your animal kingdom. Sexual reproduction is when an offspring is formed by fusion of a male gamete, a sperm, and a female gamete, an egg or an ovum that together combine to make a zygote. Asexual reproduction is when offspring are formed without the fusion of eggs and sperm. Genes come from one individual, but there are possibilities of recombination. So it does not necessarily mean via asexual reproduction in animals that you're going to have identical offspring as from the parents. Mechanisms of asexual reproduction: invertebrates reproduce by fission, basically taking the parent and splitting it into two or more individuals that are roughly the same size. Budding can occur where new individuals arise from outgrowths of existing individuals. Fragmentation, when the body of that particular organism is broken into pieces, and some or perhaps all of those pieces are able to develop into adults. When this takes place, you have to have regeneration take place as well, where the body parts are reformed. And then parthenogenesis is when a new individual is developed from an unfertilized egg. Why would asexual reproduction be advantageous? There are sessile animals that are unable to seek out mates or live in areas where there are not a lot of other animals of their particular species, and this enables them to be able to reproduce. It does allow you to produce lots of offspring at a single time, and it would be advantageous in environments that are favorable for that particular species, that are very stable, because it's going to help to perpetuate those successful genotypes. Sexual reproduction, pros and cons. Sexual females are going to have half the daughters that asexual females have, since asexual females are going to just make copies of themselves with perhaps some genes that are being adjusted, while sexual females have the option of having a male, or don't have the option, will either have a male or a female. Regardless of this, all eukaryotic species reproduce, or almost all eukaryotic species are reproducing sexually. In large part, it's genetic recombination. Some potential advantages include variation. So that will allow for increased reproductive success in environments that are varied. Being able to have an increase in adaptations to be more successful in changing environments. And again, the gene shuffling, which hopefully can help to minimize deleterious genes, hopefully eventually eliminate them from a population, although that takes a lot of time. So, asexual reproduction, you've got a female, it makes copies of itself, which then can make other copies of females. So you see lots of females going through it. Whereas with sexual reproduction, you will either have in generation two from that female a male or a female, and it can keep going from there. Reproductive cycles. Animals in general are going to have reproductive cycles that kind of relate to seasons changing. Their cycles are controlled by your hormones and by environmental cues. Seasonal temperature can play a role in this, so climate change, unfortunately, can have a negative impact on reproductive success. Ovulation is when mature eggs are released at the midpoint of the female's reproductive cycle. There are animals that can reproduce both sexually and asexually, depending on what's going on in their environment. Sometimes finding a partner can be challenging. Hermaphroditism is when the individuals have both male and female reproductive systems. This allows them to mate, or two hermaphrodites to mate, or for them to self fertilize. Some species undergo sex reversals. Certain oysters can switch from male to female, and some coral reef fish can switch from female to male. And then we talked about parthenogenesis earlier. Fertilization is going to be dependent on mechanisms that are able to bring sperm and eggs together from the same species. Um, so, external fertilization, the eggs are shed by the female and are fertilized by sperm externally. Internal, they're deposited near in or near the female reproductive tract, and fertilization takes place there. Regardless of how The eggs are fertilized. Timing plays a critical role. Environmental cues, pheromones, courtship behavior will all um, be involved in that determining if the fertilization is going to take place. So there we have a couple of frogs. Ensuring survival of offspring, internal fertilization will result in fewer gametes being produced, but also a higher survival rate of those fertilized eggs, the zygotes. Internal fertilization is also seen to be associated with enhanced protection of the embryos and care of the young by the parents. Um, Embryos of some terrestrial animals will have eggs that have calcium and protein containing shells, internal membranes, which kind of help provide support and nourishment. Other animals will keep the embryo inside the female where it develops. Um, Lots of animals, parental care, especially when those offspring are first born, will help to ensure their survival. So there we have a spider carrying the offspring. I believe this is a male spider carrying his offspring on his back. Gamete production and delivery. To reproduce sexually, you've got to be able to make gametes. Most species are going to have gonads, which are the organs that make those gametes. Some simple systems will not have actual gonads, but they'll have undifferentiated tissue that can form gametes. And others have more elaborate systems with tubes and glands that are able to carry and nourish and protect those gametes as well as the embryos that they were developed from. Okay, so there's a male fruit fly and a female fruit fly, and you can see some of the reproductive organs that even these tiny flies can have. Reproduction partners monogamy is rare. Males and or females have evolved mechanisms to decrease the chance of their particular mate mating with another individual. And females can have some influence on the reproductive success of their mates. So, next section is going to focus on reproductive organs. We're going to be focusing on the human reproductive system. For females, the external reproductive structures include the clitoris and two sets of labia that surround that and the vaginal opening. Your internal reproductive structures are your ovaries. There should be two present, along with a system of ducts and chambers, aka the uterus, that are able to get the gametes where they need to go and house the embryo and subsequently the fetus. Okay. More with the ovaries or female gonads. They lie in the abdominal cavity and they're in a tough protective capsule to kind of provide some extra protection there. They contain lots of follicles that were born at birth, and we're going to spend a lot more time with oogenesis in our next chapter. These eggs are partially developed oocytes, and they are surrounded by follicle support cells, and they are arrested in their development at that point until a female is able to go through a menstrual cycle. During those menstrual cycles, the oocytes continue their growth. They develop into an ovum, again through oogenesis. Ovulation is when the egg cell is expelled from the follicle, and the cells that are there are able to provide estrogen prior to that ovulation process to help that follicle out. And then the remaining follicular tissue that remained um, in your ovary will grow and form the corpus luteum, which is able to secrete progesterone, and that helps to maintain the lining in the uterus in the event of a fertilized egg. And if that egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum is disintegrating. The egg cell moves from the ovary, talked about some ducts, to the uterus via a fallopian tube or an oviduct. There are cilia there in the oviduct that help get the egg to the uterus, which is pretty thick and muscular, and it's also known as the womb. The lining of the uterus has lots of blood vessels. Again, that's what the corpus luteum is trying to help support the endometrium. The uterus narrows at your cervix and then opens into the vagina. The vagina itself is a thin walled chamber. That's where sperm are deposited during copulation. It's where the birth canal is present. The vagina opens to the outside of the vulva, where you have your labia majora, labia minora, hymen, and clitoris. The clitoris has a head of called a glans, which is covered by the prepuce, and the vagina, the labia minora, and the clitoris all have lots of blood vessels, and the clitoris itself has lots of nerve endings. The mammary glands are not specifically a part of the reproductive system, but they are important because they have small sacs of epithelial tissues that are able to secrete milk, which moves through ducts into the nipple so that it can provide the offspring with nourishment. Male reproductive anatomy. External structures are your scrotum and your penis. Internal reproductive structures are the gonads. There's two, each there's a testis, so two testes that produce your sperm and hormones, accessory glands, and ducts. The testes are your male gonads. They are a set of highly coiled tubes that are surrounded by connective tissue. They develop in the abdomen and then they descend into the scrotum shortly before a male is born. Sperm form in these seminiferous tubules. Leydig cells are producing hormones, testosterone, various androgens, and are scattered throughout the tubules. Sperm cannot be produced internally because of the body temperatures that are present in the mammal. It's about 2 degrees less outside. And so that is why the testes are located in the scrotum. The temperature is a little bit lower there than it would be in the abdominal cavity. Ducts. From the seminiferous tubules of a testis, sperm move through the coiled tubules of the epididymis. That's where they mature. During ejaculation, they are propelled through the muscular vas deferens and the ejaculatory duct, and they exit through the urethra. Semen are not just sperm, they also contain secretions from 3 sets of accessory glands. The seminal vesicles that are located below and behind the bladder contribute over half of the volume that is making up the semen. The prostate gland surrounds most of the upper portion of the urethra. It's able to secrete its products directly into it through several ducts, so that adds to it. And then you have the bulbourethral glands, which are small glands located just below the prostate. Okay, don't know why that's showing up. And they secrete a clear mucus just before ejaculation that helps to neutralize any acidic urine that is still present in the urethra. So the penis is the male copulatory organ. The ejaculatory duct joins the urethra in the penis so that the semen can move through it and be deposited in the female. It has 3 cylinders of spongy erectile tissue. When it is sexually aroused, the tissue fills with blood from the arteries, which is what causes the erection to take place. The head of the penis is a glans and it has a thinner skin covering, the prepuce, and the shaft, which is a little more sensitive to stimulation. And placental mammals, not humans, have a baculum bone present in this organ. Gametogenesis. Again, it differs between males and females because depending in large part based on the gametes that they form and their function. Sperm are much smaller and motile. They have to move from male to female. Eggs are stationary. They're larger and they have to be able to carry out their function within the female. Spermatogenesis, the development of mature sperm, constantly is taking place and it's very prolific. Millions of them are produced each day. It takes about 7 weeks for a sperm to develop. Oogenesis, the development of a mature egg is a lot longer. Again, I said that earlier on that the oocytes are present in their immature form before birth, and they do not complete their development until years or decades later. So they were there in the female embryo, but they are stationary until there are hormonal changes taking place in that female. Um, Ways that they differ. With sperm, all 4 products of meiosis are able to develop into viable sperm, while only one of the 4 is able to become an egg. In a female, the other 3 are polar bodies, because again, you want to have a greater division of cytoplasm in the egg, since that's going to serve as the location for the embryo to grow and develop. Spermatogenesis occurs throughout adolescence and adulthood. Um, we know that that is not the case with oogenesis. And sperm, again, are produced continuously. There are not the interruptions that we see take place in oogenesis. Okay. So again, just showing you the divisions that take place in meiosis. We're going to spend a lot more time on spermatogenesis and oogenesis in the next chapter in terms of the different components of your sperm and your egg. But you've got those kind of there for you as a reference, but we'll come back to those more in the next chapter. Tropic and sex hormones are going to play a role in regulating mammalian reproduction. We talked a little bit about this in the endocrine system chapter. Human reproduction is coordinated by hormones via the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the gonads. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, is secreted from the hypothalamus, and that is what directs the release of FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. These regulate various processes in the gonads and are able to give you to help produce your sex hormones. Besides functioning in besides functioning in gamete production, as well as sexual behavior, they also play a role in developing both primary and secondary sex characteristics. Hormonal control for female reproductive cycles. The hormones that are secreted go through a cyclical pattern. We talked about prior to ovulation, endometrium thickens with blood vessels to prepare for a potential embryo to be implanted. And then if it is not implanted, that endometrium has to be shed through menstruation. Hormones link these two cycles. The uterus changes are what define your menstrual cycle, also known as the uterine cycle, while the ovary changes are what are used to define the ovarian cycle. So you see the hormones, how hypothalamus is going to release GnRH, which will be stimulated when you have lots of estrogen and will be inhibited when you have a combination of both estrogen and progesterone. The FSH and LH are going to be inhibited if you do have lower levels of estrogen. So as you go through your cycle, you will see that the pituitary gonadotropins, FSH and LH, are going to peak at ovulation, and then they're going to go back down. We have the follicle growing, maturing, ovulation is taking place, the corpus luteum is growing, and again, if fertilization does not occur and an embryo does not become implanted in the uterus, the corpus luteum begins to disintegrate. As the follicle grows, estrogen is secreted, causing those estrogen amounts, estradiol, to increase. And then we will see that peak in LH at the point of ovulation, along with estrogen. After ovulation has occurred and that corpus luteum is starting to grow, we see that progesterone is starting to peak. That's during the luteal phase. We see the estrogen amounts are still higher, but are starting to diminish. But we have both of those present. They're both being secreted by the corpus luteum. And then again, if there is no fertilization, both of those hormones start to diminish. So we don't see GnRH being secreted in large amounts during that luteal phase because we have both estrogen and progesterone present. We see that GnRH would be stimulated when the estrogen amounts are very high, so that would be prior to ovulation, and that's when we see that peak take place. And then when we have the lower amounts of estrogen, so at the very beginning and at the very end of this 28-day period, we would have the anterior pituitary be negatively receive negative feedback in terms of releasing FSH and LH. So GnRH gets released, then FSH and LH, and that those help to stimulate your follicles growing. That would be in the follicular phase. And during this phase, you will see that those follicles, as they're growing, may basically make a bulge that forms on the ovary once ovulation occurs, and that secondary oocyte has been released. The follicular tissue is going to turn into your corpus luteum and release both the estrogen and the progesterone, the luteal phase. And then once there has been no fertilization, no embryo has been implanted in the uterus, the corpus luteum there disintegrates and the hormones start to diminish. Hormones are what are able to coordinate the uterine cycle with the ovarian cycle. The thickening of the endometrium is going to occur with the proliferative phase, which is coordinating with your follicular phase. Nutrient secretion is going to take place during the secretory phase, which coordinates with the luteal phase. Again, you want to make sure you have everything that you need for that embryo to be able to be successfully implanted and grow. The endometrium is shedded during the menstrual flow phase, which is going to coordinate with additional ovarian follicles growing. And the cycle repeats itself if no embryo is implanted in the endometrium in the uterus. Uterine lining cells, so the cells that are found in the uterus, sometimes will migrate to ectopic at locations outside of the uterus, and these cells will swell in response to hormone stimulation. They could end up on your ovaries, they could end up on your intestines, your other organs, other tissues, other muscles, and that would cause when these cells swell in response to hormone stimulation, endometriosis. And because there is nowhere for those the cells to be shed off, it just keeps growing. Menopause. After about 500 cycles, human females go through menopause, which is when ovulation and menstruation are ceased. This is not typical among animals, and it's thought that it potentially has evolved to give the mother an opportunity to better care for children and grandchildren. Again, that's just a hypothesis. So, menstrual versus estrous cycles. We've been talking about humans, and humans are the ones that are going to be having your menstrual cycles along with some other primates where that endometrium is shed through bleeding called menstruation. Um, and sexual receptivity is not limited to a particular time frame during that cycle. Estrous cycles are what we see with most mammals. The ovulation takes place after the endometrium thickens. The endometrium is reabsorbed by the uterus, and sexual receptivity is limited to a heat period where there will be some pronounced behavioral changes. And then the length and frequency of estrus, sorry about the misspelling there, cycle will vary depending on your species. So we've spent a lot of time talking about hormonal control of the female system. We're going to look at it now in terms of the male system. FSH is going to promote Sertoli cell activity, which are what are able to develop or nourish developing sperm. LH regulates Leydig cells, which are secreting testosterone and other androgens that are made by the interstitial tissue, which then can be used to promote spermatogenesis. We saw how estrogen and progesterone are able to work in a feedback way, same or have a feedback mechanism. Same thing works with testosterone. It's able to regulate the production of GnRH and FSH and LH. And Sertoli cells also secrete the hormone inhibin, which will reduce FSH secretion from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so that's kind of showing you the mechanism that's taking place there. What FSH and LH are affecting, what they make, what they are able to influence, and then how some of the products of those the reactions that take place in the Sertoli cells and the Leydig cells are able to influence negatively continued release of those androgens and hormones and testosterone. Human sexual response, two reactions predominate in both sexes: vasocongestion, which is a filling of tissue with blood; myotonia, increased muscle tension. Sexual response cycle has 4 stages: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. Excitement is preparing for coitus, sexual intercourse. Direct stimulation of genitalia helps to maintain that plateau phase and gets the vagina prepared to accept sperm. Orgasm is when you have the rhythmic involuntary contractions of the reproductive structures. It's the shortest phase. Um, Males' semen is forced through their urethra emission and then is ejaculated from there, expulsion. Females, the uterus and the outer vagina contract, but the inner two-thirds do not. And during resolution, organs are able to return to their normal state. The muscles relax. Orgasm is not needed for females to be able to reproduce, to be able to have a fertilized egg that gets implanted in the uterus. Placental mammals, embryos develop fully within that mother's uterus. You can kind of see the different steps there. It talks about how an egg is able to develop into an embryo through a series of events. We've gone through one, two, three so far. Or sorry, we've gone through one and two. We're going to look at three, four, and five right now. So conception, fertilization of an egg is going to take place in the oviduct. The zygote begins to divide by mitosis, which is going to take place through a process called cleavage. Cells continue to divide. They will eventually give rise to a blastocyst. We talked about that a little bit with diversity. A polycyst with a central cavity. This occurs about 1 week after conception. When the blastocyst has formed, it will become implanted into endometrium. And once it has implanted, human chorionic gonadotropin will be released from it, which is going to prevent menstruation from occurring and help to keep that blastocyst intact. And once it is implanted, it is now a trophoblast. Pregnancy or gestation is carrying one or more embryos in the uterus. The duration of pregnancy and species will depend on the body size and the young's maturity when they are born. Some pregnancies will terminate spontaneously, miscarriages due to chromosomal or developmental abnormalities. Ectopic pregnancy would occur if a fertilized egg starts to develop, does not wait until it gets to the uterus, it starts to develop in the fallopian tube. First trimester, when we're talking about human gestation, we typically have 3 trimesters, approximately 3 months each. First trimester is when you have the most significant changes for both the mom and the embryo. The endometrium grows over the blastocyst during implantation. The first 2 to 4 weeks, the embryo is getting its nutrients directly from that endometrium layer. The outer layer of the blastocyst, the trophoblast, mingles with the endometrium and will then form the placenta. Once that placenta is formed, blood from the embryo will travel to the placenta through the arteries of the umbilical cord and then return via the umbilical vein. So you've got your placenta that has formed. Again, on the outside of the uterus, the baby is growing. And you can see there the arteries and the veins from the mother and how they are interacting with that placenta and the umbilical cord to the fetus. Um, if the embryo splits during the first month of development, you can have genetically identical twins. If 2 eggs are released and fertilized, you can have fraternal and genetically distinct twins. First trimester is when body organs are developed, organogenesis. Major structures are all present by about 8 weeks, and that's when the embryo is called a fetus. Changes that must occur in the mother, there's a mucus plug that forms to prevent against infection. The placenta and the uterus continue to grow. Ovulation cease as well as the menstrual cycle. Breasts become enlarged, and nausea is going to be common due to the hormones that are developing to help to maintain the fetus. So there's 5 weeks, 14 weeks, and 20 weeks. Second semester, fetuses continue to grow, is quite active. The mother may feel the fetus. The uterus continues to grow. The pregnancy starts to become more obvious. Hormone levels begin to stabilize, and that human chorionic gonadotropin that prevents menstruation from taking place, its amounts will start to decline. During the third trimester, again, the fetus continues to grow, fills up space within the embryonic membranes. It's during this trimester the abdominal organs of the mother will start to become compressed and displaced. There's local regulators and hormones that work together, estrogen, oxytocin, prostaglandins, that help to induce and regulate labor. And that's how childbirth is going to take place, parturition. Um, Labor has three stages typically. The cervix needs to thin and open, aka dilation. The baby needs to be expelled or delivered, and then the placenta has to be delivered as well. So, this is a great example of a positive feedback mechanism. Um, the estrogen that is released from the ovaries or secreted from the ovaries is going to activate oxytocin receptors on your uterus. And so, oxytocin, which we're going to be getting from both the fetus and from the mother's posterior pituitary, are going to cause the uterus to contract, and that's going to make more oxytocin. It's also going to cause the placenta to be stimulated to make prostaglandins, which also are going to help to stimulate contractions. And as both the oxytocin and the prostaglandin amounts increase, you will continue to have more contractions and the baby will be expelled from the uterus. So, dilation, expulsion, and then placenta delivery. Um, why the mother's immune system is able to tolerate having both the embryo and the fetus present. We aren't quite 100% sure why that is. It's thought perhaps that there are some suppression issues of the immune response to this foreign body being present in the uterus. Contraception can prevent pregnancy deliberately. There are three main categories of contraceptive methods: preventing release of eggs and sperm, keeping the sperm and eggs apart from one another, and preventing embryo implantation. You should talk to a healthcare provider for more information on the potential contraceptive methods and the choices and risk associated with them. So here is kind of a summary of what the methods are for both males and females and what events they are interfering with. Ones we're going to talk about: rhythm method, natural family planning is when you refrain from intercourse when conception most likely. Tend to have a 10 to 20% pregnancy rate regardless. Coitus interruptus, penis withdrawal before ejaculation is unreliable. Physical barrier methods: condoms, diaphragm, cervical caps, sponges will block fertilization and they result in a pregnancy rate less than 10%. Intrauterine devices, IUDs, that are inserted into the uterus so that they interfere with the fertilization implantation result in a pregnancy rate under 1%. And female birth control pills that are hormonal contraceptives also result in pregnancy rates less than at 1%. Permanent contraception, abortion, sterilization is permanent, prevents the release of gametes. Tubal ligation ties off the oviducts. In the male reproductive system, vasectomy, or sorry, tubal ligation ties off the oviducts. In the female reproductive system, vasectomy ties off the vas deferens in the male reproductive system. Abortion is terminating a pregnancy. We talked about how miscarriages are basically spontaneous abortions due to some abnormalities in the fetus. They occur into up to one third of all pregnancies. RU486 is a drug that can result in abortion within the first 7 weeks of a pregnancy. There are sometimes reproductive issues that need to be examined, and ways that we can do that are through amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling, where amniotic fluid or fetal cells are taken and analyzed to determine if there are genetic issues that need to be addressed or to make sure that the parents are informed of. And there are also non invasive procedures, sonograms, that help to kind of give doctors and parents some information about their fetus's condition. Genetic testing can cause or can pose some pretty serious, significant ethical questions. And cause parents to have to make some difficult choices. We talked a little bit about that when we covered genetics. Infertility. There's a lot of technology out there now that can help infertile couples. In vitro fertilization mixes eggs with sperm in culture dishes and then returns the embryo to the uterus at the 8 cell stage. So, after the cell has started to go through cleavage. And then another one would be sperm being injected directly into an egg, which is a type of IVF. So, in vitro is totally in a lab. um, Sperm injected directly into an egg with IVF are intracytoplasmic sperm injection, ICSI.